I think where Keynesians get it really wrong is they have that like metaphor of like the market is an engine, and if we just, pump more money in it, it's like oil. It's going to make it run better. It's like, no. What you're actually doing is the market is this calculator, and if you throw in money, if you print money out of thin air, it's almost like every individual calculator that every entrepreneur has, you're like randomly adding and subtracting numbers. Like you're just making it more confusing.
Fiat currency is a public good. It's not private property, right? It's a socialized property. You can't fully control it, and it's always incurring this counterparty risk of the central bank counterfeiting more of it and basically milking you of purchasing power.
If you care about your financial future, you need to check out a couple of our offerings, including Swan IRA and Swan Private. Swan Private is our white glove concierge service where you get a trusted partner on your Bitcoin journey. We offer all kinds of education and research projects, as well as exclusive events to our Swan Private customers. Check it out today at swan.com/private. Also, Swan IRA. Swan IRA is the best way to gain exposure to real Bitcoin in a tax-advantaged account, like a traditional IRA, a Roth IRA, or rolling over your 401k. So if that interests you, check it out at swan.com/IRA today. What's up, Sats fans? Welcome to Swan Signal. We got a really special episode for you guys today. We got the one and only Robert Breedlove. He is the host of the popular What Is Money show, and he is also a very prominent writer in the Bitcoin scene. What's up, Robert? How you doing, man?
What's up, Sam? I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I'm super excited to have this conversation with you today. I've been reading your stuff for many years, and I thought maybe we'd start today's conversation with talking about what has transpired in the traditional banking system over the last month. I mean, there's been a ton of instability there. There's been bank runs. There's been the Treasury and the Fed coming in to quote unquote save the day. And right now things are starting to calm down, but it's still not really over. So I was wondering maybe if you could what are some of your major takeaways from what just happened over the last month? I mean, it's been a pretty crazy time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised by any of it in the least, to be frank. I think it's just another case of fractional reserve banking failing in real time. It does seem a little like when I see some of the back and forth between Janet Yellen and some local senators and whatnot on the Senate floor, it seems like there's kind of a controlled demolition going on. Like the one big impediment between the implementation where we are today and the implementation of a CBDC is the commercial banking sector, right? Like the CBDC would basically it would obviate the need for commercial banking entirely. Everyone would just have an account directly with the Fed. So it's kind of interesting to me that, one, they've hiked rates. So you're actually giving depositors a big incentive to move their deposits into either large banks or, treasury bonds, things like this. Specifically treasury bonds to get the yield. And then two, like Janet Yellen and these others are sort of representing that, okay, the big banks will always have all their deposits guaranteed, but the smaller commercial banks, it's less certain whether they'll have their deposits guaranteed. So they're like making the commercial banking system out to be much more risky, which is, I guess, incentivizing depositors to move into big banks or into treasuries. And it feels like kind of a controlled demolition, right? If you can wipe out the commercial banking sector or create a lot of doom and gloom, you could set the stage for the rollout of a CBDC in a way that's introduced as a solution to the problem that, of course, they themselves create. So it just feels like a lot of central bank bullshit going on in the world. And if people just understood that Bitcoin is a full reserve bank, that's all you really need to know, right? Like the Fed disallows Custodia Bank from coming on the scene because they're a full reserve bank, and that threatens the business model of all fractional reserve banks. The same reason the Fed disallows Custodia to have a banking charter is the same reason they're so deathly afraid of Bitcoin. right? There's a natural demand for full reserve, low risk banking, obviously. But the fractional reserve paradigm that we're in has prevented people from having access to that for a long time. So thankfully, we have Bitcoin.
Thankfully, we have Bitcoin. Tuur Demeester, welcome. How are you? We just asked the first question. I was just kind of asking major takeaways from what transpired with the banking system over the last month or so. There's just been so much instability, and maybe you could just share some of your thoughts around that.
I mean, I guess to me, the major takeaway is, QE infinity is back on. Like, we're back in money printing mode, as if, I mean, we were in denial about it for a while, or some people were like getting worried. Like, are we actually going to see a massive slowdown and interest rates like grinding much, much higher, like in the early 80s? But if you think it through, that means governments are going to go bankrupt, and all the banks are going to go under. And so, of course, that's not allowed. And so, what is it? What is Bitcoin today at 30,000 or something? I mean, I think that's just it's a sign that the market is understanding what this means. Like these bailouts, like no matter how it's actually done, the fact that you could argue that, what is it, like $7 trillion was created out of thin air because of that massive promise all of a sudden, like, hey, we're gonna, if you're a depositor with a small bank, don't worry about it. Well, that's a huge promise. Like that's, the FDIC only has, I forget the exact number, but it's like not a trillion in reserves, like far from it. So they don't have the funds, and so the government's stepping up, and yeah. Sorry, I'm not I'm not responding very briefly, but the major takeaway to me is like, money printer goes burr is back, and it's back with a vengeance.
Printer is coming.
Printer is coming,
It's
exactly.
coming. Well, Breedlove, you brought up like fractional reserve banking is kind of the underlying cause of all this, and how they won't allow a full reserve bank because it's almost too safe, right? They're like, oh, well, that will pull funds from these more unstable banks that are doing fractional reserve banking. And so, Tuur, I know that you went back and forth about some of your thoughts around fractional reserve banking, and maybe you guys can discuss kind of why that is a scam. For lack of a better word.
Yeah, man, and to Robert's point, it's true. Like if you can keep everyone in the fractional reserve system, then it's like, well, you kind of go from one bad bank to the next, and but at least people stay in the system, and that's how you prevent, a Ponzi from collapsing, is you keep everyone inside. But then if there is an escape hatch all of a sudden, and that's like a black hole, and it can just suck everything away. And but it does seem like the natural next step is going to be government bonds. Like people are gonna. It's almost like it's almost like they're like eavesdropping on crypto, and they're like, oh, the Ethereum guys, like they have this thing like proof of stake, like ooh, like perpetual income. It's kind of like the next step to keep people in the system. Like, what if we have inflation, but then at the same time we're paying out like a dividend? And so, if everyone gets suckered into short-term government bonds, then you could just call that a new currency. Like that's could be the next step in this inflationary, slow motion car crash.
Yeah, I agree. I think just to point out something, because we often talk about fractional reserve banking as if it's definitively a scam. I just want to be clear, like it's not necessarily. Like if you put your money on deposit with a bank and you sign a contract that they can lend it out at whatever reserve ratio, you expect and assume and take on that risk, that it can be a consensual market transaction. I just don't think most people, and actually like the current T's and C's when you set up a bank account, you don't own any of the money you put in that bank account. As far as I know, it's a creditor debtor relationship, right? The bank owes you that money. Doesn't mean that they can default, right? The counterparty can fail, they can default. Presumably the FDIC is there to pick up the pieces, but I think they hold somewhere in the neighborhood of like 1% of the assets that they purport to cover. So that's going to be a whole lot of money printing in the case we need to engage with the FDIC, or it's just not going to work. So with fractional reserve banking, it's kind of like the devil in the details thing, where if you're putting your money on deposit with a bank or a warehouse or custodian of any kind, and the contract says they're going to hold your money, right, and not relend it, that they're going to be a full reserve bank, then that's what you would expect them to do. But as far as I know, that again, like Custodia Bank, Narrow Bank, these operations that wanted to launch full reserve and even full reserve plus, I think Custodia was going to hold $1.08 in cash for every dollar on deposit. And so it's like beyond a full reserve bank. As far as I know, none of those options exist for people because of what we just said. Like, it would suck money out of fractional reserve banks into these full reserve banks. So it's basically a Ponzi scheme, right? You're just trying to keep the Ponzi going as long as possible by keeping people in the system. And in that way, it is kind of tantamount to proof of stake. I've actually said before, I mean, it's a rough analogy, I guess, but our existing system was gold, proof of work money, and then we built proof of stake central banking on top of it, right? Whoever can stake the most gold can have the most influence on the rules and whatnot. I think that's basically what we're trying to do again here, is just engage this proof of stake model. They're probably going to bait people in to the CBDC implementation with UBI. I think that would be a natural next step. It's like, you've got this long of a time period to convert your physical dollars into digital dollars and your commercial bank dollars into central bank dollars. And that would be kind of the stick. And then maybe the carrot would be, once you convert, you start getting UBI to the tune of X thousand a month paid in CBDC. So, I mean, again, my conspiracy theory hat is on tight always these days, but it certainly feels like they're trying to corral depositors into this new model of just total centralized control.
Right. Throughout history, I mean, in periods of high inflation, that's what happens, right? They try to entrap people in the system, because if people flee the system and flee the currency, that just kind of worsens their problems.
Mm-hmm.
And right now we have like examples of that all over the place, like the Australian central banks are ending cash withdrawals. Christine Lagarde came on recently in an interview saying that all euro transactions above 1,000 should land somebody in jail. And so is that what the future you guys expect to see? Just increase capital controls, increase restrictions? And how does that fit in with the world where we have Bitcoin? Like, it's hard for me to see how any of that works as people kind of wake up to the idea of Bitcoin. Maybe Tuur, you could jump on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Argentina has the playbook for us. I mean, they 2001, they had bank runs. People stood in line to get their money out, and the government launched this program. In English, it's called a bank holiday. Over there, they called it corralito, which is like, we're gonna corral the cattle, and it's like, but it's like it's a little corral. It's corralito, so it's kind of cute. We're corralling all the funds together, and it's a public good, which of course that's the implication. Fiat money is it's a public good. It's not really your own money, and then people can have very tiny amounts of access to that money, which is, of course, I mean, the reason why people are running on the bank in the first place is because the value of the money is crashing. Like, there's a discrepancy between what the government says it's worth and what the market is valuing it at, and at some point something's got to give, and you've got to devalue as a government. And we've seen that in the crypto space, where like all these stable coins, like, oh, it's pegged at this, it's like, what do they call it? Like a
algorithmic stablecoin.
Algorithmic peg. Like, yeah, that's just gobbledygook. Like that's not actually backed. So yeah, I mean, to me, that's there's going to be more panics and more heavy-handed attempts to try and control things. And of course, finger pointing, people are going to find scapegoats and blame the people that, like us here, are talking about the fragility of the system. They're going to, try and shoot the pianist and say like, oh, these guys were, irresponsible for calling, they called for a bank run or something like that. And so, yeah, I mean, and so weirdly, Bitcoin is going to kind of it's going to be a bit awkward, right? To have Bitcoin in the room while all this is going on. If you're not acknowledging it as an actual backup financial system, I don't know. It's kind of embarrassing at some point. Of course, they're going to point at Bitcoin is so volatile and you shouldn't trust it, and maybe like rogue nations use it, right? There'll be all kinds of rhetorical. They're going to have a big bag of tricks. But I think ultimately the way it's going to pan out is the market is going to choose Bitcoin as one of the ways to store value in this kind of inflationary depression. And thank God it's there. I mean, I, I've said this before. Like I was very pessimistic on the global financial system 10, 15 years ago because I thought we were going to get stuck in this Latin American loop of like every 10 years you have an inflationary crisis, and there's a bout of hyperinflation, and then you go back to normal like 20% inflation. That was my worry for the next 60 years or so. And so Bitcoin is really a godsend. It's incredible that it's here, and it's incredible we've had 14 years of building to get it ready for. I mean, I think the 2020s is when it's going to happen. I don't know when exactly, but we're going to see. We've seen 20% inflation already. I think we're going to see spikes of 50, 100% higher in the West.
Yeah, I agree, man. So much. What the terms shifting from a unipolar world to a multipolar world, right? Where there's not going to be this uniform reservation demand for the dollar. Like we're hearing about the BRICS countries now trying to create their own currency block. To whatever extent that's successful, that just reduces reservation demand for the dollar, right? Which means you have to accelerate printing even more to keep covering and servicing the national debt, for instance, in addition to imports and everything else. So I just think I see the world ripping itself apart. And if you study the history of hyperinflations, that's usually what happens, right? Like things get really scarce and people start to become more insular. And we're just seeing that on a kind of a global scale, which I don't think we've ever seen before. And I think too that, because we're in the digital age, the pace at which information moves, the liquidity of ideas is just so much faster. These bank runs now aren't even bank runs, right? They're API driven inflows and outflows. And I forget the numbers for SVB, but it was like billions overnight, right? It was like,
Yeah.
What I heard was like $42 billion withdrawn in one day.
yeah. So what? That's not a run, right? There's not people going to a teller window to withdraw that. That's, it's digital financial movements basically. So I would expect that the fragility and the bank runs would they would materialize faster. And, this whole thing about restricting transactions to lock people into the system, restricting cash transactions or cash withdrawals, such a slap in the face, right? That you're telling people they can only transact or take out $1,000 per day or 1,000 euros per day, while at the same time, the purchasing power of 1,000 euros is collapsing, right, to the tune of 20%, 50% a year, or whatever it may be. And it just gets to Tuur's earlier point that fiat currency is a public good. It's not private property, right? It's a socialized property. You can't fully control it, and it's always incurring this counterparty risk of the central bank counterfeiting more of it and basically milking you of purchasing power. So, I mean, it's just, I guess this is the bad thing about getting into Bitcoin is you start seeing the world for what it is, and it's just kind of nasty and scammy, full of platitudes and bullshit to try and smooth it over. And you see these like central bank commercials where it's some little intern talking about how trusted the ECB is and how they're preserving the monetary integrity of the euro and looking out for your best interests. And it just makes you kind of sick, honestly, over time. And I don't know. I would expect all of that to get worse in the years ahead because people are going to be feeling the pain. So I'm sure the propaganda machine will be rushing to probably blame Bitcoin. Actually, I'm sure Bitcoin will ultimately get blamed as this system continues to unwind. It would be just such a two birds with one stone move to just blame Bitcoin, which is the solution to the problem, for causing the problems that you yourself as a central bank caused. I think we'll end up there, and I don't know. I guess we've got a lot of clown world left in front of us.
Well, there's like Tuur, I think you called it inflation denialism. It is a slap in the face for these central bankers. The ECB was blaming the inflation on wage pressures, and then the Bank of England said money printing doesn't cause inflation. It reminds me of the stories from Weimar Germany, where those central bankers refused to believe that their policies were actually causing any of the inflation. And we're kind of seeing the same thing today. So do you think they're just doing this because they publicly can't admit that their policies that they have to keep doing is actually causing the rising cost of living? Or do you think it's even maybe a scarier possibility that they've just drank the Keynesian Kool-Aid, so much of it, and believe that it's not possible that their policies are causing the inflation? Like, it's hard for me to understand because it seems so obvious that they are inflating the supply of fiat currencies and that is contributing to the inflation, but they just refuse to attribute it at all to their policies.
I have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, like I've been thinking about this for a long time. Like, and I remember Safedine telling me about how he was like working on the fiat standard and kind of like explaining and it was the first time I heard that approach, basically trying to really understand like how did the fiat system come about, and acknowledging that there were some issues with the gold standard. There was so much gold being confiscated, and the world was increasingly globalized, and then slowly you actually had digital information going around and trade happening, and I guess initially with the fax, and so basically like through the air, like lightning fast communication. So it does make sense that there was a need for a new kind of paradigm. And I think that generally speaking, the basis of the fiat system was this idea of like consensus. Like, we're going to sit together, like the real elites, the financial elites, and we're going to kind of create this system where we get to a political consensus of like, how do we want to do this, and then if there's problems, we'll fix them. And so like from an engineering point of view, you could look at it and then say like, well, they tried to build a new system, but they incurred a lot of technical debt. Like, they basically got the footing kind of wrong. And you can go back and kind of, understand why that was. Like, it was, I mean, when it was devised was like in between two world wars. Like, that's not ideal in terms of circumstances. Well, no, I guess technically it was, sorry, 1913, of course, is just before the First World War. But so that means that there were already tensions building up. And then the way things were administered, especially if you go forward with the IMF and the BIS, and those were just additional mechanisms to try and control this monster that they were creating, which at the time they thought it was a great thing. I mean, that's probably how all monsters get started. They're cute little babies. And so I think the way I interpret things now is just like, they're just people, and it's a generational thing by now. Like, their families, their whatever, the elite school they went to, have totally bought into this consensus paradigm. Like, and we see it in the crypto space as well, like social consensus, this like magical thing that it's true. Like, theoretically, consensus is a valid way to avoid conflict. We sit together, we work it out, and then we have a uniform way of communicating it and implementing it. So from that point of view, I don't think these people are evil. I think they just kind of think that this is all we got. And so we just have to, and if it means we're going to lie to the public, if that allows us to kind of maintain consensus, that's what we got to do. And so I do believe that they lie knowingly. I do believe that. And that they are just their social circles. they have all kinds of taboos when it comes to particular other paradigms. It's almost like heresy, right? If you're in a Keynesian lineage and you're going to all of a sudden become an Austrian, I don't know, you're probably going to get excommunicated somehow. So I don't know. I'm not saying that it's going to be a fun ride, but that's kind of how I look at, it's a paradigm clash, and probably just like with how science progresses, like one funeral at a time. Like, we're not going to convince these people. It's going to be a very slow, iterative process, and of course, the wealth transfer is gonna speed things up a lot. Like their influence in the world is going to probably diminish as more and more of the world is moving to a hard money standard.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, Bitcoiners can probably relate to this too. I just the immense social pressure there is to, inside of Bitcoin circles, like thou shall not shitcoin, right? That's kind of the social pressure you feel in Bitcoin maximalism. But imagine how much more social pressure there is when you're running a central bank. You were academically came up with a Keynesian education. All your mentors came up of the same ilk. All the trajectory of history, right? Like this thing's been around for 110 plus years, all based on this core ideology. Like you can, even if you wanted, even if you were a diehard, you could like look at Greenspan, right? Greenspan was basically libertarian before he sold his soul to the Fed, right? He's got that great piece that he wrote saying that a sound store of value has to be made illegal for a welfare and warfare state to work, right? Like it to implement welfare and warfare policy requires that citizens don't have access to a sound savings device, right? He was like diehard libertarian in his early years, and then what did he become? Like Darth Vader of the Fed, just lying about everything to make it pass. So, I agree. I don't think it's this notion of like a centralized conspiracy of a bunch of guys sitting around in a room smoking cigars saying, how are we going to crash the world economy and plunder as much as we can on the way down. It's more like what Tuur's saying. I had a guest on, Ed Dowd, actually. He called it a meta fraud. So instead of it being like an actual conscious fraud, it's more about broken incentives and opportunists taking advantage of those broken incentives and breaking them further over time, right? And it reminds me too of that old quote. I'll paraphrase it. It's like something. It's really hard for a man to understand something that his paycheck depends on him not understanding, right? Like they are benefiting. When I say they, I mean like the shareholders of central banks, right? The cartel bosses of the Jerome Powells and these other figureheads that we see. They profit immensely from seeing you rich. So not only is it in their profit interest, it's in their ideology that printing money, again, they think rather than production preceding consumption as it does in economic reality, they somehow think that consumption, the tail can wag the dog, right? That you can increase consumption through monetary policy, which will drive production. Total bullshit. We all know it, but they believe that, right? They believe that to their core. It's central to the entire Keynesian ideology. And I think that's just it, right? It's like almost, and this is something I try to articulate. I say that there's a great quote: human nature is like water, it takes the shape of its container. I think the containers that we pour ourselves into are incentive structures, basically. And so when I look out on the world, I see a lot of people moving themselves in pursuit of money most of the time. So I think incentives are like one of the primary drivers or motivators of human action. And when you have an incentive system that's, let me just get as close to the money spigot as possible at all cost, right? To damned if I'm adding any value to society or not. It just creates these conditions where non-productive actors are rewarded, right? Political, people engaging in espionage and intrigue and the art politic, warfare, like all these things get rewarded in a fiat paradigm. And so is it any fucking surprise that the world is awash in people like this and activities like this? And maybe, admittedly, it's probably not that simple, but I think we can do humanity a great service by swapping out the base layer of incentives, right? To move away from people moving in pursuit of fiat currency to people moving in pursuit of hard money. It just makes it just rewards productive, peaceful, cooperative behavior. And if you want a world that reflects those characteristics, then you have to reward it. So,
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And there's another dimension, or at least I think it's just another way of looking at exactly what you're talking about is I was thinking about that recent Bernie Madoff documentary. I think it's on Netflix.
Yeah.
It's like 3 parts, I think,
mm,
which is really cool. Like they really go into the nitty gritty of how things worked, um, and what struck me is that how stuck he was, and how like really in this paradigm, because not only was he, in order to continue, in order to kind of, not go to jail and just kind of be a father to his family and whatnot, he had to continue the Ponzi.
mm-hmm,
But then additionally, his entire social network they were all dependent on him. And of course, a bunch of them had serious, I mean, knew what was going on basically, and knew what not to ask. They were just like, but so he had very powerful people who were dependent on him. And that's why he feared for his life. Like once he went to jail, he was afraid that they were going to come after him. And so I'm not saying exactly the exact, same type of
mm-hmm,
people, but similar dynamics are happening, I believe, in the central banking world.
mm-hmm,
Like, Wall Street to a large extent is dependent on these bailouts, is dependent on stimulus, is dependent on information about when the stimulus might happen. That's why there's this revolving door between these institutions. So again, I'm not saying there's like one evil conspiracy, but it's more like people are trapped in these incentive
mm-hmm,
systems after a whole career. Like, what are you going to do? Come out and say, I'm sorry? I mean, you're only going to come out and say, I messed up if everything is exploding
right.
already. But like, as long as things are kind of going, you have a family to look after. There's charities that you're donating to. I mean, whatever, it's just the older people get, it seems like the more they can really get stuck in certain ways of life. And so that's why I never really believed in politics, like, in political, action. If the incentive structure is wonky and weird and inefficient, then you just have to build something new that has something better to offer.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I like the cypherpunk so much.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's very much like being caught in a lie, right? They basically are caught in a lie that Keynesian economics
Mhm.
is total horseshit. But they have to keep pretending like it's real, right? Like, oh, we'll just print a few more dollars. And whereas if you're actually caught in a lie, well, what can you do? You can keep spinning up new fictions to overlay the old fiction. And before you know it, you're like lost in this web of deception. Or you can just tell the truth, right? And it's like, what's that saying, that it's sour in the beginning but sweet at the end if you're telling the truth, but if you're telling a lie, it's sweet at the beginning but sour at the end, something like that. And they've just kicked the can so far down the road that things are just so unbelievably sour now that, again, thank God we have Bitcoin as a source of truth that's hopefully going to contribute to the dissolution of all this mess.
Yeah, like Havenstein is a good example. I need to read up on it again, but he was the chairman of the central bank during the Weimar Republic, and he died like, I think he had like a heart attack or something, like 1 or 2 years after the currency collapsed. It just goes to show like these things. This is very, very sour.
Mm-hmm.
It's extremely stressful to live through the culmination of I mean, the Ponzi scheme collapsing basically.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the Ponzi scheme or of central banking in general kind of depends on ignorance, right? Of like financial literacy.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, over the last like 5 years, I feel like people are starting to wake up a little bit. Maybe I'm just in an echo chamber. I don't know, but it seems like even like the term fiat, like my normie friends know what that means now, and they had never even heard the term like 5 years ago. And it just seems like the social media and the internet has allowed people to learn more about central banking. And so, is that what you guys are seeing too? And like, if do you see one day soon people are going to finally wake up and realize like they are being harmed by these policies and these central banks through their inflationary policies?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right. Right, a necessary ingredient of the fiat currency complex is a generalized financial illiteracy. No question about it. Because if people understood what money and full reserve versus fractional reserve banking is now, like we'd probably go straight into hyper Bitcoinization, right? Everyone would be like, oh, no shit. Like, of course, obviously I should move all my purchasing power over here where no one can steal it or mess with it or manipulate it. As far as people waking up, I mean, I sense there's been an awakening since COVID, which I guess is just the reality of the pains of government oppression and economic manipulation and whatnot. You know, a lot of my normie friends are now much more tinfoil hat than they ever were. You could just chalk that up to the conspiracy theorist win streak, I guess, over the past few years. Like at some point, you're going to change teams, right? If your team just keeps taking one L after the other, you're just going to say, I'm going to go with the tinfoil hat guys now.
Yeah.
And the thing we mentioned earlier too, the digital age and the pace and rapidity at which information can move, the liquidity of ideas, like it's a lot of bullshit's getting exposed, right? Like seed oils. This is a major thing, right? Seed oils are in every food with a label. Like every food with a label, basically, in the United States, at least, maybe not so much internationally. Not 100%, but let's say 99% of foods with a label have seed oils in them. And seed oils are like toxic sludge for human beings. Well, thank God for social media exposing that and bringing that to the surface. And now I have an app on my phone that's called Seed Oil Scout. It tells me which restaurants in town use seed oils and don't. And that's a social media thing. The ancestral diets, the carnivore diet, all these other things. People are just figuring out that things like the government food pyramid were total bullshit. So I do think it's only a matter of time before this illusion of fiat currency and central banking is dissipated as well. I don't know if just the digital age is going to solve that for us. Like, because there's some people that just don't want to spend the time learning or doing the homework, even though the information's out there and it's abundant and it's largely free. But I think when you combine that liquidity of ideas and information with the pain that's coming, right? The inflationary pain, all the capital controls and other duct tape that bureaucrats will put on this system to try to keep it intact. Like this, the combination of those two things is going to drive us towards a tipping point, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. The kind of two things, like the tools being available and then the pain that's present. Like other thoughts I had about what is available nowadays that wasn't in the past is I think we're kind of in a golden age of television, and there's just Hollywood is kind of dead, like there's so many movies that are being produced in so many different ways, and TV series, and then additionally documentaries. There's just like so many well-produced documentaries with all these streaming platforms, so that things that seemed fringe in the past, like now you can actually watch a very well-produced documentary that presents a certain viewpoint, and you see the people talking. And then additionally the podcast, like that's kind of like the golden age of radio all of a sudden, what we're doing now. People can see our faces, they kind of like, it's easy to like read an article where there's like a little sneer about like, oh, this guy, he's like really cookie and he believes this, versus seeing the guy talk for 2 hours, and like making up your own mind. And that, it's almost like, I feel like Joe Rogan like epitomizes that. Like he really brought a lot of ideas that were on the fringes and kind of made them all of a sudden just normal to talk about. It doesn't mean you have to agree, but at least it's part of the public conversation. And then I think that in terms of pain, I think it was no coincidence that Friedrich Hayek won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1974. It's when the inflation started kicking in. All of a sudden, there was a lot more interest in classical liberal ideas. And I'm sure in the 1930s as well. The big danger was, the Bolsheviks and the Red Scare and all kinds of economic just horrible things that were happening around the world. And all of a sudden, of course, there's more populism, but then on the other hand, there is a kind of counter movement. And I think Bitcoin definitely fits in that counter movement of like, all right, so yeah, we can try and grab whatever we need and agree with Marx. But if we want a long-term future for our kids, well, what are some more reasonable things that are more likely to result in peace and prosperity? So yeah, I definitely see all those ingredients just right now. I think I looked it up recently. The interest for Austrian economics actually up in the last few years, significantly up. And again, it's not all of a sudden. I remember we translated "What Has Government Done to Our Money?" That little tiny Rothbard book, where he just like nails it. He just explains it very briefly what the fiat system is about, and written in the '60s somewhere. We translated it, we published. It was really a nice slick little book in Dutch, and we couldn't get the bookstores to carry it because people weren't interested. This is like 2010 or something. And now I go back in Belgium and I see the road to serfdom in translation in a mainstream bookstore for sale in Belgium. So they just when people feel pain, they look for solutions.
Yeah. Well said.
Yeah. And truth. Well, you brought it up, Tuur, this idea of a more peaceful world, more prosperity. People in Bitcoin kind of talk about that, how Bitcoin could kind of bring about more world peace. And it's like a really big idea. And I was wondering if you guys maybe think that's true. Do you think that, Bitcoin standard could result in a more peaceful world?
Do we, Robert? Do we think that's true? Maybe we're just saying it like, oh, it sounds
Yeah,
nice.
it does. Yeah, it sounds nice.
I mean, it seems obvious to me, and maybe I'm just overly simplifying, and please tell me if I am, but here's how I typically explain it. I try to make it very simple. It's like there's two ways to acquire wealth in the world. One is making, one is taking, right? You can make something, which is you work, you create, you plant the garden, you build the business, you construct the asset, whatever it is. Also in the making category is trade with other people, right? You could make something and trade it with other people to get different things. And that's capitalism, right? That's free market capitalism. It's the social cooperation under the institution of private property, right? So it's like you keep what you earn, I keep what I earn, and we can freely trade everything. That's one way to create wealth and acquire wealth in the world. So far as I know, the only alternative to making is taking, right? You just go and use coercion or force or violence to seize or confiscate someone else's hard-earned asset, whatever it may be. And so if that's accurate, then all we should really focus on to improve civilization and to improve social cooperation and the division of labor and wealth creation is making taking, not, let me see, what's a different word for making? Facilitating a world where taking is made as expensive and risky as possible, right? So make it very difficult to steal from people or make it risky. That's kind of what the rule of law is supposed to do. It's like you don't go and just steal cars. Well, maybe if you're in San Francisco, you do, but typically you don't go break into people's cars willy-nilly because there are repercussions for things like that. So what is that doing? It's imputing a cost to would-be takers, right? That maybe they won't take that risk. It's changing their expected value calculation of taking. So what is Bitcoin? Well, it just makes taking very expensive and difficult, if not impossible, if you custody it properly. And this applies at every scale, right? This applies to the guy trying to break into your house and steal your money, right? If you've got cash in a desk drawer, he's probably going to take it. But if you've got Bitcoin in a multi-sig, he's probably not going to figure that shit out, right? It's pretty complicated, especially if you put it in the right protocol, et cetera. It also applies at the nation state level, right? If Germany invades Poland and they seize the gold out of their central bank, well, if we're on a Bitcoin standard and Poland's got all that in a big multi-sig, Germany's going to have a much harder time seizing the gold. So we're talking about reducing the carrot, I think, to coercion, compulsion, and violence. That seems to me a pretty obvious shift in the incentive landscape towards peaceable human interaction and away from war and violence.
Well said.
Well said. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it makes me think of the socialist calculation debate, which, back in the late 1800s, when Marx came with this, amazing idea or whatever. At least it was a novel idea, kind of like of, maybe property isn't all that great, and maybe we should just kind of gather all the goods in society and have the benevolent, which is it's that's a really old, that's Plato basically. Have the benevolent dictators decide on what to do with it. And so, what Mises argued, and this is then in the early 1900s, what he started arguing is that even if you appoint like the most benevolent, angelic, um, dictators to decide what to do with all the productive goods in society, they, even with the best of intentions, they couldn't calculate what is needed. And that's where, like, Leonard Reed comes in. He wrote this little book called I Pencil, where he just looks at this simple pencil. It's like, all right, let's look at this and see how it's put together. And like the graphite maybe comes from Italy somewhere, and then there is some paint in there, and that has like 10 different components who are sourced from all around the world. And then in the back, there's like a little bit of Arab gum, and where that comes from, the Middle East somewhere potentially, and then there's a bit of metal, and so that was maybe dug out of the ground in Sweden, and then they refined it, and then so magically this came all together in that one pencil. And so if you are, you are the Marxist dictator, like how do you know to put all that together in this one pencil? And then also, how do you know how many pencils the market wants, and what colors of pencils, and where the pencils should be delivered, and and how to prioritize this delivery over that one? It's just all these questions, and that's what hard money allows. It's basically, it allows the economic machine, the free market machine, to efficiently calculate where goods should go in the economy, because it allows every individual entrepreneur to decide whether or not this activity is profitable, which means that it's on a net basis, it is what people want, or if he's turning at a loss, which means that it doesn't make sense to keep doing this. And I think where Keynesians get it really wrong is they have that like metaphor of like the market is an engine, and if we just pump more money in it, it's like oil, it's going to make it run better. It's like, no, what you're actually doing is, the market is this calculator, which is very, very efficient, incredibly complex, like way beyond any individual person's capacity. It's just all that communication that's happening. And if you throw in money, if you print money out of thin air, it's almost like every individual calculator that every entrepreneur has, you're like randomly adding and subtracting numbers. Like you're just making it more confusing. And so that in a nutshell is just a calculation debate. And so you could kind of go at it from the political angle. Like it doesn't make sense to have, the dictators ruling society, but you can also look at the calculation debate from the money point of view. It's like, all right, well, if we agree that the free market is this incredibly complex computer, well, what kind of money is going to make it run the most efficiently? And that's hard money. Like you don't mess with the money supply, and and that's when the organism is going to be the healthiest.
No, I think it's so wonderfully said. I shout out I Pencil, like one of the best essays ever. If you've never read it,
Really good. I mean,
Really
it's
is.
it's almost like a meditative exercise
So
to read
good.
that, right?
Yeah.
It's
really
it's
good.
like I can explain the idea in a minute, but if you read it, it's like kind of like you get this like whoa, and that's like that every item in your house, the same thing applies.
Yeah.
Like it's so humbling.
Yeah, it gives me like a reverence for the material reality we've surrounded ourselves with, right? The book Rational Optimist, Matt Ridley does the same thing, but he's talking about a computer mouse. And it's just if you haven't read it, go read it. It's very poetic, and I think it'll give you a reverence for capitalism. Like there's no other solution to get this standard of living other than free trade and sound economic calculation.
And it also applies to every Che Guevara T-shirt and every Marxist sticker on an iPhone. Like it's like
Everything, like
right?
every human
Yeah.
creation that you find valuable basically comes from this process. Um, and I think on Marx, he I don't know if he properly, I'm going to say this, I don't know if it's entirely correct, but I think he basically properly identified the problem or a problem, which is, we had wealth inequality. Not that wealth inequality is the problem. He saw some people with a lot and some people with a little, right? And he thought the abolition of private property could somehow resolve that. His prescription was the exact opposite of what we need, right? What you really need is super strong private property, and then you maximize wealth creation. So that would be, you're never going to fix wealth inequality because people are just different, right? We have different skills, different circumstances, life paths, etc. But what you can optimize for is aggregate wealth creation. So even though we're going to be unequal in the distribution of wealth, we could create the most capital per person, right? The most wealth per capita. So it's like he kind of identified a problem that's real, but misprescribed the solution. Like he prescribed the abolition of private property when what we actually needed was much stronger private property, in my opinion. And on money, like it's kind of tying this into iPencil too, I guess. It's so only with hard money or sound money can we're basically extending human rationality into the material domain, right? That we can now price all these exchanges with one another. And, Mises' definition of a price is an exchange ratio, basically expressed in money. So we're comparing and contrasting all the results of human activity in a way that gives us a quantifiable input into that economic process, that economic calculator. And without those inputs, that calculator does not work, right? It breaks. And when you're printing money, what are you doing? You're distorting those inputs, but you're also violating private property. So it's like this is why I call it monetary socialism. Like you're completely regressing down the scale, right? You're retarding economic calculation and you're stealing from savers. So you're moving away from iPencil and towards Soviet Russia, basically. And it just blows my mind that more people aren't keyed in on that. We need people to read stuff like iPencil and Mises and Rothbard and Hoppe. So I guess I'm excited to hear that Austrian economics is gaining in popularity.
Makes me think of Boris Sidis. He was like a contemporary of William James, and if you read his books, he's always like he was a Russian immigrant and was like in prison in Russia for 3 years and was very much against collectivism. And he keeps talking about the Philistine versus genius, and so like I'm just like there's so much Philistine stuff happening that is, like seed oils and fiat money, and maybe we should bring back that word. It's just like kind of like that, like primitivism and like it's almost like it's not really like cunning evil. It's just more like being a brute.
Yeah.
That's what he meant. Mm.
Not only does go Breedlove.
I was just going to say, it kind of reminds me of sophistry versus philosophy too. As you end up with a lot of these sophists that are just saying whatever needs to be said to win the argument versus the philosopher that's actually pursuing truth in earnest. Fiat currency slides the world towards sophistry.
So it's like the manipulation of money by these central banks distorts the price signals, makes it difficult to coordinate economic activity, which we talked about. But one thing I learned from reading your work, Breedlove, is you take it a step deeper and it actually distorts like the perceptions of the economic actors and their goals. And it's difficult to know the real wants of society when they're manipulating society, right? I just always thought that was like a fascinating idea. If you just take it a step further, it almost changes society at a more fundamental level of what we value when they distort the money.
There's an experiment. I learned this from Jordan Peterson, actually. It's called the selective attention experiment. And they basically tasked these individuals with counting the number they'd play a video for them. There were like two basketball teams, one in a black shirt, one in a white shirt. And they'd say, count the number of passes. People are running all over the screen, passing the basketball back and forth. They say, count the number of passes of whichever team, white or black. It was like a 30-second video. And they would, press play, run the thing. People could pretty accurately count the passes. It's not too difficult, right? There's just kind of one basketball moving from teammate to teammate. And then at the conclusion of that experiment, they would say, okay, how many passes were there? 7. Okay, that's correct. Now, did you notice the 6-foot gorilla in the video? And like, no shit, I think like 70 or 80% of people, like, this is a very repeated experiment. It's been going on since the 70s, something like that. If people don't know about the selective attention experiment, they consistently, to the tune of 70 or 80%, don't see this 6-foot gorilla walk into the middle of the frame, flail his arms back and forth for like 8 or 10 seconds, and then walk off the frame. And so the learning from this is that your goals determine actually what you see in the world, not just like how you see or how you relate to the world, but like when you get on a goal-oriented path, like you block out other things, right? You're just eye on the ball, literally eye on the ball in this case, to the point where you miss a giant fucking gorilla walking into the middle of the screen and shaking his arms back and forth. So, if you twist, if you can just print money, if you're the Fed or a government, you can just print money and say, go do this, go do that. Like, to what extent are you manipulating people's actual motivations, right? They're not even free to discover what's meaningful to them. They're just kind of, doing their job. And what do you hear in all of these atrocities when, when they ask these German soldiers, like, how did you gas the Jews? Like, how did you overcome that resistance in yourself to do that? And they say, oh, I'm just doing my job. Not to make it like too extreme of an example, but I'm just saying it's like, I don't know. It's an open question. How much does money printing manipulate what we actually see and then what we actually do in the world? I definitely think it's a net negative. I don't know to what extent, but that's where I got that kind of line of thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. I think it's true. I think if you can distort people's perception of value, then you could that relates to everything. Like, people, like, value is kind of the base layer for judgment. And so, yeah, you're almost like, if you can print money, you're like in charge of a gaslight factory. Like, you can just kind of, willy-nilly, and of course you don't know in what kind of ways the perception is. Like, if you ingest a lot of seed oil, like, you don't necessarily know what's going to go wrong in your body, but something will eventually.
Get big.
Yeah, I mean, lately I still haven't like nailed it. I still feel like but I've been wondering even about things like music. People say like, oh, there wasn't anything like the 60s, and like, as if the musicians of the 60s were so amazing. And then there was another, like, if you look at like the most liked songs over the last 60 years, there's like a big spike in the late 60s, early 70s, and then another smaller but still substantial spike in like the early 90s. And so it's like, you can be like, well, whatever, people just learned, there were more people in bands learning how to play, and that's why. But I'm starting to think there's a lot more to do with like the audience, and like because people get so energized when they're interacting with an audience that's really tuned in. And like, if you see these audiences of the 60s, like, it's not just girls fainting. It's like, it was almost like, this, people were so enchanted, because not just because they loved the music, but because there was meaning in the music. Like, there was kind of a rebellious atmosphere. It was about civil rights. There was just so much going on back then. And then I think in the early 90s, part of that was kind of an outburst of freedom of speech. All of a sudden, like, the 80s were a lot about censorship. Like, if you see like, Frank Zappa and other people like testifying in all kinds of hearings, because they wanted to ban certain, just music based on lyrics. They wanted to ban this. The 80s was pretty dark. And of course, there was the atomic bomb scare and the Cold War, which came really close. And so I think the 90s with the internet were just kind of like elated. So I'm starting to feel that the musicians were great and have been great in this past 40 years because a lot of them have lived through all of it, right? So it's like, but I think there's some kind of alchemy that happens and you see it, I think, in the Bitcoin space where people get really riled up, and so they stimulate the artists to give the best. You hear these songs that have like 3 minute, like a Pink Floyd song was like, I was listening to it, had like a 5 minute musical introduction,
Mm-hmm.
and then the conclusion was like a 4 minute song. It's like people don't do that if your audience is zonked out and they're dissociated and they're gaslit. You don't feel inspired to really give the very best of yourself. So I don't know, it's just something that I've been thinking of lately, that I'm like watching like Rick Beato's latest video on like the top 10 most popular streaming songs today, and like of one of them at the end, the best thing that he can say is like, it was like a Miley Cyrus thing. He's like, oh, this is actually a song. All the rest, they were just kind of like, they were just so just tunes. Like they weren't even, there wasn't a decent structure to it, decent melody, just nothing. So, and anyway, I'm just saying, like, I'm starting to feel less like I'm judging the artist, but more that like there's this kind of just a cultural thing that sometimes happens that just stimulates people to give the best of themselves back to the audience.
Yeah, I mean, we sound like maybe a bunch of crazy money nerds, but I think suffice it to say that manipulating money affects a lot of dimensions of human life. Like we don't know to what extent and which ones necessarily, but you have, next time you talk to Will Cole over at Unchained, you have to have him tell you his story about, he was having a cabin built in Wyoming, I think. I forget where he owns a cabin. And he was saying he was working with a contractor, was helping him build the cabin. He went and bought a bunch of tools and brought them back. And the guy's like, oh, no, these aren't going to do. These tools were made in the 1990s. You have to get the craftsmen that are 1971 or before. Those are the only tools that like have high structural integrity or whatever. So it's like, is that really a thing too? Like, is it, we went off the gold standard and like the integrity of tools went downhill? Like, I find myself buying stuff now and like I get defective products left and right. Like it seems like more than ever the past few years. And is that because we just had this pulse of money printing? I don't know. I mean, we're definitely pumping entropy into that economic computer, that calculator we described. So how many things does that derange? I don't know.
Well, you definitely see it in the housing space where, like, the main builders. Sorry, if there's more, I want to
No,
hear
that's
it. Let
it.
me let you finish. Oh, okay. Yeah, it's just, and I'm sure you agree. Like, if money is very cheap, if interest rates are artificially low, which is that's how you create inflation. You make it artificially cheap. Then the main people that are going to be bidding on plots of land and building materials are no longer going to be generational wealth, that has a bunch of land that they're slowly trying to add value to, and they, if you, I'm not saying this is the ultimate society, but Edwardian, Elizabethan, Great Britain was pretty prosperous, and I believe only 10% of the population actually owned their own home.
Mm.
People would save in money, they have a life insurance, and then physical property like buildings were built by, yeah, you could call it elites, by people who were entrepreneurial or generational wealth. And so they would build buildings that would last a long time because they just expected it to stay in the family. Whereas, it's a big contrast and there's lots of nuance. But generally speaking, if the money is artificially cheap, all of a sudden people who have very little means of their own can lever up. And that's what all these real estate guys tell each other. And the new audience, they've been, I mean, I was checking out meetups here in Austin, and like 70% of them are still to this day real estate meetings on like how to flip houses. And so you get these people, and again, I'm not blaming them, it's just the incentives work that way. So for very cheap, you can buy a property, build a house, and then resell it because the consumers also have cheap credit, so they get to buy it real quick. And so people end up living in a house for like 3, 4, 5 years, and then they flip it again. And so why would you do anything better than just building some cardboard that looks good on Instagram versus, like the wall that I'm looking at behind you, Sam, like, just, maybe like structural masonry or something that is maybe 20%, 30% more expensive, but that will still be standing 100 years from now. There's just that incentive is so I totally agree with Robert. Like, we cannot fathom the ways in which cheap money and the fiat system has changed society. It's everywhere.
Yeah. Once you see it, you can't really unsee it too.
Yeah.
Bitcoin definitely does that.
Yeah.
Which is a good thing.
Which is a good thing.
Transition the world to a better system, and so it's a good thing if you can't unsee it.
It's a good thing, but I do find myself being, I don't know, seeing things that other people don't see. People start to think you're like, oh, you're just reading into it too much. Like, no, I see like product inferior quality all around me that did not used to exist, but it just kind of might make you a bit of a social pariah, is all I'm saying. So you should probably hang out with Bitcoiners more.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why, like, to me, that's why I chose like the megaphone over the trying to micro convince people, because I actually let that go for many, many years. It just kind of, and just, it was hard to make that transition. But it's kind of like, it's people, I have noticed people will come to Bitcoin when they're ready. And sometimes it takes 5 years, sometimes it takes a week, sometimes it takes more than 10. I mean, who knows how long.
Good. That's I feel like that's the most insidious part of inflation, is the decrease in the quality of goods. You feel it. It's hard to quantify, but you can just see it everywhere. Let's, just one more question for you guys. I want to get your thoughts on just this recent price action of, we've come off the lows around 15 and we're at 30 now. It's up like 80 something % on the year. And, in the midst of this banking crisis. And so, Tuur, I saw a tweet. You said you didn't think we'd see 20K ever again. So I just wanted to get your guys' thoughts on this rally. What you guys are thinking.
Sure, yeah. I'm just pulling up the chart here. Yeah, 29,340 is where we're at right now. Yeah, I mean, the bull market has started again. I really think we've seen the capitulation. Like the big one was just these bailouts. Like that is we're gonna look back at that. It's like that was the pivot. Bitcoin jumped from 18 to 26 in a day or something. This is crazy move. That was on the day of the bailouts.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, it's not to say that I'm. Of course we can pull back a little and we can go back to maybe what is it, 23,000 and whatever. Like maybe there'll be another scare. Maybe like a big exchange is going to all of a sudden go belly up, or who knows. But to me, the bull market has started, and later this month, actually, there's something that is going to communicate my bullishness.
Oh, nice.
That will come out. Yeah, and then I've been looking at the just kind of, because I've been looking at it for a long time, but looking at the Ethereum Bitcoin charts, and that's starting to look pretty toppy to me. And to me, that's the canary in the coal mine for the entire crypto space. And I think we've been saying it all along, like they're dinos, they're decentralized in name only, and now the government is actually going after it. I'm not saying I'm all in favor of that, and I'm sure there'll be lots of collateral damage with these lawsuits and fines and everything, but I do think that fraud should be pursued and investigated. And I think a lot of these crypto coins are built on lies, and just like with the .com crisis, like certain survivors will emerge and become huge, like Apple today, and others will just fizzle and die, like Yahoo, places like that. And there were a lot of scams that went to zero. So anyway, to me, that's almost like the bigger underlying story, is that I think that the Bitcoin dominance is really going to march forward, and I'm kind of happy. There's always going to be scams, of course, but at least I'm happy that there's going to be at least a bit less confusion in the next year or two, that Bitcoin really is the safe haven, and you can just happily forget about the other 11,000 coins.
Yeah, I look forward to that day as well. I just think it's great that we have this irrepressible barometer for all the bullshit in the world, right? So you see Bitcoin actually functioning as a safe haven in this case, or at least maybe not a safe haven, a full reserve bank. It's like once we saw that the printer is coming again, Bitcoin popped. So I'm not much for short-term price predictions. I have no idea. Like, it's one thing I've learned about Bitcoin price. It's like always expect the unexpected. You just have no idea which way it's going to go. But to at least see that it's trending positively when everything else in the world seems to be trending negatively, I think is a good sign. And yeah, I'm just frankly happy to have Bitcoin, because if all we had were dollars in banks right now, I don't know what I guess I'd be burying gold in my backyard.
We'd all be gold bugs.
Because it's so abysmal, like the counterparty risk and the surveillance, and it's just complete nonsense. So thank God for Bitcoin.
Thank God for Bitcoin. Well, thanks, guys. Yeah, Tuur, you got anything else?
Just that I'm just reminded of Bill Miller. I think in 2021, he had this note in his letter to his investors saying, Warren Buffett famously called Bitcoin rat poison. He may well be right. Bitcoin could be rat poison, and the rat could be cash.
I love that.
Anyway, I just love that. Yeah, this is the beginning. We had the longest bear market in the history of Bitcoin in the past 2-3 years, and so I think this could set us up for the longest bull market. I think it's going to be Bitcoin fever. I think people are going to just be stunned at how these moves are, and they're going to be chasing it, and they're going to not understand what's happening, and it's. I mean, it's exciting, but also, I mean, buckle up, because I think it's going to be pretty stressful as well. Like seeing these giant moves, and there's going to be 50% crashes thrown in there, and I think it's going to be wild the next 2-3 years, really wild. And of course, I'm happy because I think the world needs more Bitcoin, or the world needs Bitcoin and more people to understand and use it. And luckily, the price is kind of it's a mechanism that allows people to discover it. If the price goes up, a lot more people will pay attention.
Absolutely. Our downloads on the show are highly correlated to the Bitcoin price. So yes.
Yeah. Same with my followers and all that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Now I'm bullish. Thanks, Tuur. Thanks. And thanks, guys. This was a great convo, and kind of out of time right now, but it sounds like both of you guys have pieces coming out soon. So keep an eye out for that, listeners. I always read what these guys put out, because you guys put out fantastic pieces all the time. So thanks for coming on the show. Where can people find you?
Yeah, I'm at whatismoneypodcast.com and at Breedlove22 on Twitter.
Yeah, for me, there might be some announcements later in the year, but for now, it's just Google my name, and my Twitter account is the most active. So just go there.
Right on. Well, thanks, guys. Appreciate it. You guys have a great night, okay? If you care about your financial future, you need to check out a couple of our offerings, including Swan IRA and Swan Private. Swan Private is our white glove concierge service where you get a trusted partner on your Bitcoin journey. We offer all kinds of education and research projects, as well as exclusive events to our Swan Private customers. Check it out today at swan.com/private. Also, Swan IRA. Swan IRA is the best way to gain exposure to real Bitcoin in a tax-advantaged account, like a traditional IRA, a Roth IRA, or rolling over your 401k. So if that interests you, check it out at swan.com/IRA today.